Shalom. I'm Yehoa ben Avraham, and this is part 3 of A Key to Understanding the Word of Yah. You're going to see here today that correct interpretation of Torah is based on the right order of importance. Once we know what the most important words of the Torah are, then we need to use that information, use that understanding to correctly understand what is written in the Torah. In part 1, we saw that to understand the word of Yah begins with a willingness to be obedient to Yehova. Just as Melech, King David said, he said, Reshith Chokhmah Yirath Yehova, Sekel Tov B'kol Oseim Tehilatho Amedeth La'ad. The fear of Yehova is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding of all those who do his commandments. So a willingness to obey Yehova is the first step in understanding the word of Yah. Secondly, in part 2, we saw that the 10 matters are the most important words of the Torah. They are the most important words ever spoken to mankind. These are the key words of the revelation that Yehova gave Yisrael and gave all mankind at Har Sinai. Today, in part 3, we're going to understand that correct understanding of the Torah should flow outwards from the clearest revelation we have received. Using the chart again, let's bring up the chart. Correct interpretation of the Torah is based on the order of importance. That order starts with the Aseret HaDvarim. When we understand that the Aseret HaDvarim were first of all given to Moshe and written with the very finger of Yehova, as we read in Shemot chapter 31 verse 18, where it says, when he had ended speaking with him on Mount Sinai, he gave Moshe 2 tablets of the witnesses, that is ha'eduth in Hebrew. Tablets of stone, written with the finger of Elohim, be'etzba Elohim. So the Aseret HaDvarim are foundational. These are the most important words in the universe. These are the words written in stone, and all the remaining books expand and expound on these foundational teachings. Secondly, we know that the Aseret HaDvarim were given in the ears of all the children of Israel, but the children of Israel couldn't bear to hear the rest of what Yehova had to say. So they said, don't let us hear the voice of Yehova anymore, lest we die. And Moshe went up to the mountain and received what now is written for us in chapters 20 through chapter 23-33, and referred to in chapter 24 verse 7 as the Sefer HaBrith. And Moshe wrote down all the words of Yehova and rose up early in the morning, and he took the book of the covenant, that is in Hebrew the Sefer HaBrith, and read in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that Yehova has spoken we shall do and obey. Sefer HaBrith, the book of the covenant, was written by the hand of Moshe. This is al pi Yehova, meaning by the mouth of Yehova, biyad Moshe. And it was direct. Right at the time that we got the Aseret HaDvarim, right after that, Yehova would have spoken these words himself to all the people. The people couldn't bear to hear it. So Moshe received it and wrote it. And right after he received it, he wrote it all down. And this is, again, exceedingly clear revelation. And it defines the covenant relationship that we have with Yehova. This is what we're supposed to walk in. This defines our agreement, our bonded relationship with Yehova. Now, this is further expanded by what we would then call Torah. Torah is the instruction. The Hebrew word Torah means instruction. And these instructions that are al pi Yehova, meaning by the mouth of Yehova, written down by Moshe, who was closer to Yehova than anyone who wrote after him. So his writings are much clearer. This is the clearest revelation, the clearest instruction we have. And this should be the lens by which we understand anything else. So the Torah, these instructions written by Moshe, which were really spoken by the mouth of Yehova, can be found in Breshith, Shemoth, Vayikra, and Bamidbar, the 4 books that Yehova spoke to Moshe and that Moshe wrote down. We would call these Sefer HaTorah, or the Torah. They're not one book, though. There's no one book called Sefer HaTorah. Sefer HaTorah is a convenience. When we think of these as one scroll, this is a convenience. We're still putting together 4 separate books. Breshith, Shmoth, Vayikra, and Bamidbar are all separate Sefarim and should be thought of that way. And when we combine them and think of them as the Torah, we're doing that as a convenience because in those 4 books we find what Yehova commanded us to do. We find what Yehova spoke by his own mouth and what was written for us by Moshe. And that's why we think of those 4 books, we group them together and think of them as Torah. And it says in Bamidbar, chapter 36:13, these are the commands and the right rulings, or mishpatim, the judgments, which Yehova commanded the children of Israel by the hand of Moshe in the desert plains of Moab, by the Yarden of Jericho. You read this in Bamidbar 36:13, right at the end of the book of Bamidbar. It's a summary, it's a conclusion. The first 4 books are Yah's revelation to mankind by the hand of Moshe, and the 5th book is Moshe's explanation of these first 4 books. We group them together. Commonly they are called the Torah, but in reality, when you group all 5 books together, these are the 5 books of Moshe, because Moshe wrote this 5th book. But as we're going to look now in Devarim chapter 1 verse 5, we're going to see that the book of Devarim is really Moshe's explanation of the first 4 books. It's a commentary on the first 4 books. It is not al pi Yehova, it's al pi Moshe. And that's a big difference. And so we cannot group them or think of them in the same light. We don't use Devarim to interpret the Aseret HaDvarim. Now, if something that we're reading in Sefer HaBrith seemed to be out of line with something we were reading in the Aseret HaDvarim, then we would have to use the Aseret HaDvarim to interpret or understand what's in Sefer HaBrith, because the Aseret HaDvarim are weightier. They have more weight than what's in Sefer HaBrith. So the Aseret HaDvarim, meaning the 10 matters, those are the weightier matters. We use those as the basis to understand anything else in the Torah. Likewise, let's say, for example, you're reading something in Sefer Breshith, that is the book of Breshith, the book of Genesis. It may seem to not be in line with what you read in the Aseret HaDvarim. Well, if that's the case, the understanding is that we're not reading Breshith correctly. That would mean that we need to use Aseret HaDvarim as the foundation, the lens by which we better understand what's written in Sefer Breshith, because there's no contradiction. The misunderstanding is with us. We're not understanding it correctly, but we use Aseret HaDvarim to better understand what's written in Breshith, not the opposite way around. The mistake many people make is that what they try to do is take an obscure verse written in Devarim or one of the prophets, and then they say, well, you see, based on this, we no longer need to keep what's in the Aseret HaDvarim. For example, they say we no longer need to worry about Shabbat. When obviously Shabbat is clearly one of the commandments of the Aseret HaDvarim. It's the 4th commandment. It's very clear, strongly laid out, and there's no way around it. And so you don't use some obscure verse from one of the prophets to try to say now, oh, therefore we don't need to keep Shabbat. That's just a basic example to try to help you understand how to use this chart and how to use this understanding. Use the stronger to help you better understand that which may be obscure or more difficult to understand. Moving out or extending out from Sefer HaBrith, we then have 4 books that are commonly grouped together, and this again is for the sake of convenience that we can refer to as the Torah. I say again, this is for convenience because anciently we have to keep in mind that each book, each scroll was its own book. Each scroll was its own. Now we group them together, and usually we find, let's say if you go to a synagogue, you're going to find 5 books grouped together and referred to as the Torah. That's going to be Breshith, Shmoth, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim. This grouping, though, is not ancient. This is a convenience of grouping together of books. And when we, and to get the right understanding of Torah, we need to unpack this grouping and think about each book separately, where it lies and what it really means. Even though today we have a scroll we refer to as the Torah, which has 5 books, we should note that only the first 4 books were written by the mouth of Yehova, by the hand of Moshe. In Hebrew we say al pi Yehova, by the mouth of Yehova, biyad Moshe, by the hand of Moshe. Those first 4 books contain what came directly from Yehovah's mouth to Moshe. The 5th book, as Moshe himself explains, was not written that way. The 5th book was actually Moshe giving his own commentary on the first 4 books. Let's notice that. Let's turn now to Devarim chapter 1, verse 5. These are the words which Moshe spoke to all Yisrael beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the desert, plain, opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel. And he goes on to describe exactly where and when this was spoken. These words were spoken. And he says in verse 5, beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moshe undertook to declare this Torah saying. This is not the best translation. I'm reading from the Scriptures 2009 translation. It doesn't really give you the essence of what is really being stated here. Let me share to you how it's written in the New American Standard Version, and then I'm going to read the Hebrew. In the New American Standard, it says, across the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moshe began to explain this, they say law, saying. Law meaning Torah. I'm going to read the Hebrew now. Be'ever HaYordan, be'eretz Moab, ho'il Moshe, be'er eth HaTorah hazoth le'mor. So he began to be'er. Now this word be'er is a word that literally is used for well. It's like to draw out of a deep well. He began to draw the deeper meaning out of the Torah. The Torah was already completed when the book of Devarim started. We're at Devarim 1 verse 5. Moshe is explaining the Torah that had already been revealed. So the Torah was finished. It was revealed already. And Devarim is a commentary. It's Moshe's explanation. That's why it's also thought of as a repetition of the law. Devarim is a repeating. It's really Moshe's explanation of what was already revealed. And we already had revealed to us the first 4 books, which are where we find the actual words that were spoken by Yehova by his own mouth and written down by Moshe's hands. In those first 4 books, we find all we need to know to have a right relationship with Yehova. In fact, when we think about the rest of the books, right? We go on from Devarim, and we might conclude here, therefore, that the book of Devarim should be, rather than grouped with the Torah, grouped with the other books like the prophets, for example. As we extend outward in this chart, we see the next layer outside is the prophets. The prophets refer to, and the Hebrew word for prophets, by the way, is Nevi'im. The prophets refer to a grouping of books, and again, this grouping is simply by convenience. There's no one book called the prophets. There's no final agreement by everybody in all the religious sects that agree on what the prophets should be. It's a grouping, and it's a convenience grouping. But these books that we call the prophets contain the historical narrative of Israel, along with some specific books written by some specific prophets, like Yirmiyahu, as in English they say Jeremiah, or Yeshayahu, the prophet Isaiah. Keep in mind, though, that these books were never intended to add to the Torah, to give us a new instruction, or to reveal something that we didn't already have revealed in the Torah. Rather, they were written to encourage faithfulness and obedience to what was already written in the Torah. In fact, at the beginning of the book of Melachim, in the book of Melachim, when I'm saying Melachim, that's a word that translates to kings. And I do mean the book of the kings, even though if you look, you'll see that anciently, the book of Shmuel, which now we have 1st Shmuel, 2nd Shmuel, 1st Kings, 2nd Kings, all 4 of these books initially were all one scroll. These are not 4 books. These initially were all one scroll, but no one is quite certain of the authorship of the entire scroll. There's different theories. Some people think it was Yirmiyahu that wrote it. Regardless of who wrote it, let's just turn to what now we call 1st Kings, 1st Melachim chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. And the days of David drew near to die, and he commanded Shlomo his son, saying, I am going the way of all the earth, and you shall be strong and be a man, and guard the charge of Yehova. Another way of saying guard the charge is keep the charge, is a better way of saying it. Keep the charge of Yehova, your Elohim, to walk in his ways, to guard his laws, his commands, his right rulings, that's his judgments, mishpatim, and his witnesses, his eduth. As, and this is the key part, it is written in the Torah of Moshe, so that you do wisely all that you do wherever you turn. Just want to read that verse for you in Hebrew. V'shamarta eth mishmereth Yehovah Elohecha, laleketh bid rakav, lishmor hukothau, mitzmothau, umishpatau, ve'edothau. Kakatuv b'torath Moshe lema'an taskil es kol asher ta'aseh ve'es kol asher tifnei sham. Again, kakatuv, as it is written in the Torah of Moshe, so that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn. So that Yehova may fulfill his promise which he spoke regarding me, saying, if your sons are careful about their way to walk before me in truth with all their heart and soul, you shall not be deprived a man to occupy the throne of Yisrael. David told Shlomo all that he needed to have a right relationship with Yehova was written, kakatuv, b'torah Moshe. There are some who believe that we don't have everything written. There are some that say, well, you need the oral law. That's not what David said. David said, all that is written, kakatuv, as it is written in the Torah of Moshe. You have everything you need, Shlomo. You have everything you need right here to succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn. Now, extending out even beyond what we would call the prophets, we have books that we refer to as the writings. These are books that we would refer to like Tehillim or Mishlei. Tehillim is Psalms, Mishlei Proverbs, Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, these types of books. And again, these are Hebrew writings. They provide great historical knowledge and maybe they give inspiration. There's psalms, meaning songs that we sing, and poetry and beautiful prayers that we can emulate and use as springboards to help us pray. But we don't use such texts to actually determine our relationship with Yahweh or the way in which we're going to walk, or to contradict the commandments and the things that Yahweh has commanded us to do. You can't read something in the Tehillim and then think that that suffices to do away with something that's clearly commanded. Like how often people will use a misunderstanding or a incorrect reading of something in the Tehillim to say, you see, this proves that sacrifices are done away. Which, really, I mean, even if you just used common sense, you'd realize that at the time the Tehillim were written, anybody who was writing what we now conclude to be a part of the grouping of books or Tehillim that are in this book called the Psalms or the Tehillim, anybody who wrote any of those would have fully been believing in sacrifices. They would have been offering sacrifices. So obviously, if you think that one of the Psalms is suggesting that sacrifices are done away, clearly there's a misunderstanding of the Psalm or a mistranslation of it in English, because the writers clearly all believed in sacrificing to Yahweh, which is a whole nother topic we're not going to get into today, but it's important to note that no, there's no psalm that says you shouldn't sacrifice. And if you read that in English, you need to use the Torah to interpret what you're reading, not the other way around. Don't use the Tehillim to interpret the Torah. Use the Torah to interpret the Tehillim. I hope that point is now very clear. It's also important at this point, as we're understanding this chart most clearly, that once the temple was destroyed and Israel was exiled, that signaled that we had entered a time where Yahweh had hid his face from Israel. And any books written post the exile would not have the same understanding of the spirit of Yahweh, because Yahweh had hid his face. We notice that. Just look at what's written in the book of Devarim, Devarim 32 verse 20. It says in verse 16, they moved him, that is Yahweh, to jealousy with foreign matters. With abominations they provoked him. They slaughtered to demons, not Elohah. Mighty ones they did not know, new ones who came lately, which your fathers did not fear. You neglected the rock who brought you forth, and forgot the El who fathered you. And Yahweh saw and despised, because of the provocation of his sons and his daughters. And he said, let me hide my face from them. Let me see what their end is. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom there is no trusting. So Yahweh hid his face from Israel. Again, notice how this is also spoken of in the book of Achah. Achah chapter 3 and verse 42. It says, we have transgressed and rebelled. You have not forgiven. You have wrapped yourself with displeasure and pursued us. You have killed. You have not shown compassion. You have wrapped yourself with a cloud so that prayer does not pass through. That's how far Yahweh hid himself from us. So that even when we cried in prayer, Yahweh would not listen. He would not hear our prayers. And so during this time of our captivity, this is a time when we would not have the clearest revelation. So books written after the fall of the temple, after the exile from the land, would not have the clear revelation that we had when we had prophets who were full of the spirit of Yahweh, and at a time when Yahweh was clearly not hiding his face from his people. So we cannot give the same weight to the books written after the fall and the destruction of the temple and our exile that we give to the books that were written beforehand. So again, just keep that point in mind. Now, again, what we've learned is that you start from the clearest revelation, the Aseret HaDvarim, then work outwards. Next level would be Sefer HaBrith. From that, you use again what was Al Pi Yahweh B'Yad Moshe. And the other books and other writings can only supplement that. They can never contradict what was Al Pi Yahweh B'Yad Moshe. If we follow the method of study that I just outlined using this chart, the will of Yahweh is going to be clear. We will sincerely see what it is that Yahweh wants us to do. And that's why he said that when we awaken in the land of our captivity, we will be able to return to him. He says, and I'm quoting from Devarim chapter 30, verse 11 through 14, "For this is the command which I am commanding you today. It is not too hard for you, nor is it far off. It is not in the heavens to say, who shall ascend into the heavens for us and bring it to us and cause us to hear it so that we do it. Nor is it beyond the sea to say, who shall go over the sea for us and bring it to us and cause us to hear it so that we do it. For the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart to do it." We don't need anybody to break it down for us. If we just use this approach, start with the clear and work your way outwards, you'll be able to understand the will of Yahweh. Nonetheless, we have a choice. Yahweh isn't going to force us. Once we see the truth, it's up to us to commit and obey. He continues saying, "See, I've set before you today life and good, and death and evil. In that I am commanding you today to love Yahweh your Elohim, to walk in his ways and to guard his commandments," meaning keep his commandments, "and his Torah," his laws, "and his mishpatim," his right rulings. "And you shall live and increase, and Yahweh your Elohim shall bless you in the land which you go to possess. But," he says, "if your heart turns away and you do not obey, and shall be drawn away, and shall bow down to other mighty ones," that's other Elohim, "and serve them, I have declared to you today that you shall certainly perish. You shall not prolong your days in the land which you are passing over the Yarden to enter to possess it." We read of similar warnings in the Proverbs. That's Mishlei, chapter 4, verse 26. "Consider the path of your feet, and all your ways are established. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil." Even though the Torah clearly shows the importance of the Aseret HaDvarim, some will veer off to the right hand by adding to the law and making it unrecognizable, and others will veer off to the left and water the commandments down, or even say they are done away with. They say, oh, the laws of the Old Testament were nailed to the cross. Or they say, we no longer under the curse of the law, as if somehow the law of our Creator was a curse. The prophet Yeshayahu warned of this. He said, Yeshayahu 8 verse 20, "To the Torah and to the Edut," that is the testimony, "if they do not speak according to this word, it is because they have no daybreak," or some translations say they have no light in them. Anyone or any book claiming the Torah of Yahweh has been done away with, has no light in it. Dawid, king of Yisrael, wrote in Tehillim 119, the longest of all the Tehillim, prays to express his love for the Torah, the Aseret HaDvarim of Yehowah. Notice some of the things he said about the Torah. He says, Tehillim 119, verses 46 through 48, that I might speak of your Aduth, your witnesses, before sovereigns, before kings, that is, and not be ashamed, that I might delight myself in your commands, that is, the commandments, which I have loved. He loved the commandments of Yehowah. Verse 48, that I might lift up my hands to your commands. Again, your commandments, what you have commanded, which I have loved, while I meditate on your Torah. That's what Dawid said. He loved Yehowah's Torah. Tehillim 119, verse 46 through 48. And I'm going to use Sepharia for this. I will speak of your decrees and not be ashamed in the presence of kings. I will delight in your commandments. And here again, the word translated commandments here is mitzvothecha, which I love. He says, I reach out for your commandments. Literally saying, I lift up my hands. I lift up my hands, okay? Which I love. I study your hukekah. That's what Dawid thought about the Torah, about what was written in the Torah. He went on to say, skipping down to verse 72, Tov li Torath pika, me alfei zahav wa kasev. I prefer the teaching you proclaim to thousands of gold and silver pieces. Verses 97 through 100. Oh, how I love your teaching, your Torah, Torah Teka. It is my study all day long. Your commandments make me wiser than my enemies. They always stand by me. I have gained more insights than all my teachers, for your decrees are my study. I have gained more understanding than my elders, for I observe your precepts. Verse 105. Your word is a lamp to my feet, a light to my path. Verse 115. Again, keep in mind, every time we refer to the word here, we're not talking about the books that most people think of when we think of the Bible. We're talking specifically here about the books that were al pi Yehowah b'yad Moshe. Breshit, Shmoth, Vayikra b'midbar. That's it. These are the books. These are the books that Dawid was talking about. These are the books that he told his son, Shlomo. Follow the Torah. You have everything you need in what was written in the Torah. And these are the words he was lifting up his voice, speaking so boldly about and saying, proclaiming that these are the words he loves. He said now in verse 115, keep away from me, you evildoers, that I may observe the commandments of my Elohim. He said in verse 165, the Hebrew there, Shalom Rav le'ohave Torathecha, wa'ein lamo mikshol. Those who love your teaching enjoy well-being. They encounter no adversity. They have Shalom Rav. They have great abundance of peace. Finally, verse 172. Ta'an lishoni imratheka, ki kol mitzvotheka tzedek. My tongue shall declare your promise, for all your commandments are just. And I like the way some other translations translate the word imratheka, meaning my tongue shall speak of your word. What Yehowah says was came out of his mouth, al pi Yehowah, written for us by the hand of Moshe. For all your commandments are righteousness. On the other hand, moving away from now talking about those who think that the law is no good and done away with, you might have people erring on the right side, like rabbinical Judaism, by trying to drown the Aseret HaDvarim in a sea of 613 commandments. They say the 10 commandments have no special significance above any in the list of 613 that they have created. And please note, I say created because nowhere in the Tanakh even do we find a listing or mention of 613 commandments. This idea came up long after even the books that are commonly grouped together as the Torah, the prophets, and the writings were compiled and completed. There's no listing of 613. Mention of 613 first occurred in the 3rd century of the Common Era when Rabbi Simlai mentioned it in a sermon that is recorded in Talmud Makot 23b. It's also important to note that once the rabbis came up with this list of 613 commandments, they then intentionally shifted the focus of daily ritual away from the Aseret HaDvarim to the 613 instead. This shift resulted in a blurring of what is really important and opened the door to gross misunderstanding of the Tanakh. Moreover, 613 commandments may even stand as a stumbling block for those who seek to return to Yahweh, because for many, they may seem to be a task far too difficult to achieve. If we look at some ancient documents, though, like the Nash Papyrus, a papyrus fragment written in the 2nd century before the Common Era, literally around 150 BCE, proves that during the time of the Second Temple, Jews recited the Aseret HaDvarim daily. This fact is further documented in the Talmud itself in Mishnah Tamid 5:1. Now, this is important because today, Jews don't read the Aseret HaDvarim on a daily basis. The rabbis stopped the daily recitation of the Aseret HaDvarim. In Tractate Yerushalmi Barakot 3c, it reads this way: it would be proper to read the 10 commandments every day. And why don't we? Because of the zeal of the heretics, lest they say, quote, these alone were given to Moshe at Sinai, unquote. According to this tractate, rabbis frowned upon the public daily recitation of the Aseret HaDvarim, that's the 10 commandments, precisely because the daily recitation showed the Aseret HaDvarim, the 10 matters, were more important and authoritative than any other commandments. The rabbis teach all the commandments are of equal significance, and every teaching, including the teachings of the Talmud, are equal in weight. And by doing so, they elevate the significance of their own ideas and seek to give themselves authority. Historical evidence also showed, prior to this rabbinical push to the right, that in addition to reciting the Aseret HaDvarim daily, we find evidence in the Talmud and in archaeological findings dating back some 2,000 years, showing that the Aseret HaDvarim were written on the doorposts, not a box. No, the actual Aseret HaDvarim were written on the doorposts and placed in the tefillin, that is the small boxes that you put on your head and on your arm. However, now, if you look in any of those boxes, you won't find the Aseret HaDvarim in there. You'll find instead the instructions that we should put the Aseret HaDvarim instead of actually finding the Aseret HaDvarim. As it reads in Devarim chapter 6, verse 8 through 9, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on your doorposts of your house and on your gates. Now, I imagine most people today would be surprised to learn the rabbis eventually stopped Jews from writing the Aseret HaDvarim on the parchments used for both tefillin and mezuzot, that is, the doorposts, and instead instructed that these parchments should contain the 2 for mezuzot or 4 for tefillin scriptural texts in the Torah that instruct us to write these words on our mezuzot and bind them on our arms and foreheads. But as crazy as this may sound, the mezuzot and the tefillin that you buy from a Judaica store, that you put on your doorpost, that you find on anybody's doorpost that bought it from a Judaica store, they do not contain the Asereth Hadvarim, the 10 matters. The key words, the words that are most important, are left out. Once we decide to obey Yahweh, the Torah will become clear. And it becomes more and more clear when we even embrace the ancient traditions, just like we saw. The Asereth Hadvarim are so important, you should make sure they're on your doorpost. The Asereth Hadvarim are so important, you should be reciting them when you wake up and when you lie down. Twice daily. Say them. Repeat them. It will help you. Like David said. He said in Tehillim 19 and verse 8, Torah Yahweh timimah, meshivath nafesh, eduth Yahweh ne'emana, makkimat pethi. The teaching, the Torah of Yahweh is perfect, renewing life, renewing the nafesh, the soul. And the eduth, okay, the eduth, that is the 2 tablets of stone, are the eduth. Remember we saw it, it's the Aron ha-eduth, the ark of the eduth. Each one is a witness. The eduth of Yahweh, that is the 10 commandments again, the Asereth Hadvarim, are enduring, making the simple wise. Yes, we will grow in wisdom and understanding and in clarity by focusing on that which is most important. We will start to notice, once we're doing these things and focusing on that which is most important, how some commonly held beliefs are in fact corrupted views of the Torah, and in particular, the Asereth Hadvarim. For example, most people hold the idea that 5 of the Asereth Hadvarim were written on 1 stone, and the remaining 5 on the 2nd stone tablet. Surprisingly, this was not a common view anciently. In the tractate of the Meklita de Bachodesh, you'll find this statement. It says, Rabbi Hanina ben Gamliel says that each tablet contained 5 commandments, but the sages say 10 on one tablet and 10 on the other. That is, the tablets were duplicates. In other words, prior to Rabbi Gamliel's suggestion, the common view was that all 10 were written on each tablet. The fact that all 10 were on each stone is supported further when one understands the commandments establish a covenant. It is likely that they were duplicated on both tablets. This can be compared to diplomatic treaties of ancient Mitzrayim, in which a copy, that's ancient Egypt, in which a copy was made for each party. There are numerous verses that refer to the 2 tablets as the witnesses or eduth, testimonies. You can look at Shemoth chapter 25:16, 25:21, 25:22, Shemoth 26:33, 26:34, or Shemoth 30, verse 6. In addition to these facts, once we follow the commandment of writing the Asereth Hadvarim on our doorposts in such a way as we can actually see them, we will notice that the first 4 account for most of the space, and the last 6 take far less than half the space used by all. When we look at the commandments written this way in Ivrit, it becomes obvious that all 10 would be written on each stone. In conclusion, what we have seen in this 3-part series, we have learned that the Asereth Hadvarim are the most important words in the Tanakh. In fact, since they were spoken by Yahweh, such that the entire nation heard them, we see they were the most important words ever spoken. They serve as the key to understanding the will of Yahweh. These are the words we should recite daily when we lie down and when we rise up. And they should influence everything we think, say, and do. As King David wrote in Tehillim 119, verse 9, he said, "How can a young man keep his way pure?" The answer? By holding to your word. David continued in verse 10, "I have turned to you with all my heart. Do not let me stray from your commandments." May we all follow David's advice. Let's center the Torah. And at the center of the Torah, let's center the most important words ever spoken, the Asereth Hadvarim. Let us not wander, O Yehova, from your commandments. Shalom, shalom.